Good morning, everyone. Welcome, ambassadors. Welcome to our second scholarship workshop of the course. And this one will focus on eligibility criteria. Now, to get started, we will just look at a few common statements from scholarship applicants that have been rejected for the programs they applied for, because what I often hear from them is something like, I applied for a scholarship, but I was rejected because I didn't meet the eligibility criteria. Another common one is, I didn't know that I had to be or have or do X, Y, Z in order to qualify for the scholarship. And then last but not least, another common one is, I knew I didn't meet the criteria, but I thought I'd apply anyway and see what happens. Now, my issue with that is that if you apply for a scholarship, even though you don't meet the eligibility criteria, you're basically wasting your and other people's time, right? In addition to that, you are setting yourself up for disappointment. We know it takes time to prepare a scholarship application. You need to write letters, you need to collect documents. Sometimes you even have to pay fees to get those documents. And spending all that time on something that is basically impossible for you to reach because you don't meet the criteria is pointless. Nobody likes wasting their time. Scholarship evaluation committees also don't like having their time wasted by looking through applications that they can basically chuck out immediately. And of course, you also don't want to spend your time and energy on something, get your hopes up, only to then receive a letter stating that you don't qualify. So unfortunately, your application won't be considered. So to avoid this, we need to be very aware of what eligibility criteria are, how we must classify them, and how we address them in our own scholarship applications or when assisting others with their application. So what this workshop will focus on is to first look at the basics and the definition of different criteria. We will then also look at the differences between broad and narrow criteria. And the most important part is to distinguish between hard, in other words, non-negotiable criteria, and the softer criteria, the ones that you can work around a little bit. And then last but not least, we will also briefly look at the implications for scholarship advisors, in other words, for you once you have completed the program and start assisting others with their applications. So without further ado, let's jump right in. In terms of the basics and definition, so eligibility criteria are basically a framework for both applicants and the selection committee, and they determine who can or cannot, or who should or shouldn't apply for a particular scholarship. So looking at those criteria will give you a first indication of your chances of success and whether or not it's worth putting your time and energy into an application. Now, as most of you have already seen, I know all of you have applied for scholarships at some point in your lives. The typical criteria are, for example, age, nationality, gender, academic performance, work experience, publications, if it's more of an advanced academic position, but also things like your or your parents' financial situation, and skills and achievements, as well as, in some countries, volunteer and community work. This is obviously not an exhaustive list. There are many other different criteria. Some programs are very, very specific, but those are kind of the main categories that those criteria fall into. And I'm going to say it again, don't waste your time by applying for a scholarship if you don't meet the criteria. So the main problems in terms of eligibility criteria that I have seen when interacting with scholarship applicants are, for instance, that the criteria are sometimes very broad or they're not entirely clear. So it states something like applicants must demonstrate leadership qualities, or applicants must demonstrate academic excellence, right? And those are difficult because they are not numeric or they are not specific. So leadership qualities can be anything. Good academic performance will depend on the course that you're in, the class that you're with, the university you're at. So there's often confusion about what exactly the selection committee is looking for. Another common issue is the opposite. So, for example, the criteria can be very narrow. They're very, very targeted. And that obviously means that many applicants are excluded. We will look at examples of that later. But for instance, if you say applicants must be between 18 and 20, and they must be from a specific country and study in a specific field of study, and they must also have a migration background, that obviously excludes a large number of applicants. So only very, very few will even be able to apply, right? Now, another thing that I quite often hear, especially when we are posting opportunities through Africademics, is that some of the criteria are perceived as unfair. So for example, why is the scholarship only open to Kenyans? Why do I have to demonstrate XYZ? Why do I have to first gain university admission if I want to qualify? So there's often this feeling of that the criteria are unfair and that they exclude certain people, or that they're set at random. And we will also chat about that later. And the other one is that quite often, especially in countries like Germany, the United States, or the UK, and also for bigger programs, the criteria can sometimes be very, very complex, very complicated, and they're often not clearly communicated. So for example, you might have a website that outlines the general conditions of the scholarship. It tells you how it works, how you can apply. But then the criteria are hidden somewhere in a PDF that needs to be downloaded from the page. And people often overlook that. So that is actually something that scholarship foundations will also need to look at to ensure that they make it easier for us as applicants to understand the criteria. And another issue is, that's more on the applicant side, that they don't take the effort to actually familiarize themselves with the criteria. So rather than digging through that scholarship website to find that PDF where the criteria are listed, they go straight to the application form and start filling it in without being aware of what the selection committee will actually look at and what they will require. So once again, you're basically, if you're doing that, jumping right into the application process, and you're spending time and energy on an application without even knowing what you might qualify for and what not. And then last but not least, and that is something that we will look into in more detail, is that not all application criteria are the same. Some of them are hard, some of them are non-negotiable. If you don't meet them, you don't even have to apply. But others are a lot more flexible. So it's important to distinguish between the two and to know how to work around them in your application. Now, looking at broad versus narrow criteria, which was one of the first points that we've mentioned, one example of a very broad criterion is to say, for example, applicants from anywhere in the world are invited to apply for this scholarship. This is often the case with scholarships offered by universities to international students. So because they don't want to discriminate, they basically open the program up to applicants from anywhere in the world. Now that's a great thing because it's easy, or it's not as strict in terms of being eligible for it. But it also means that if you apply for this particular program, you will face very strong competition because anybody can apply, right? So in most cases, all the foreign students at this university will apply for the program. And just because of that, your chances of getting it will be smaller. And the other extreme then is a very narrowly targeted program. So for example, applicants must be female, they must be between the ages of 18 and 25, they must be nationals of South Sudan and hold a PhD in astronomy. Now, if you think about it, I don't know if there are people out there in that age group from that country who have a PhD in astronomy. This is not a real requirement from a scholarship program, but it's just an example of what some of those criteria can look like. So as you can see, it's very narrow, it's very exclusive. But on the other hand, if you meet those criteria, you might just be the only person who does. So there will be a lot less competition for those kinds of programs. And those small kind of like niche scholarships, they're often offered only once or maybe only for a certain occasion. Sometimes they're offered by local organizations and foundations. So it's always worth looking into those, especially if you're dealing with applicants that don't meet this typical profile that we have of a scholarship applicant. I mean, if you think of someone who receives a scholarship, I think we usually think of someone who's very strong academically, they're involved in the community, their leaders in whatever field that they're in. And not everybody is like that. We're all different. We all have reasons for why we don't meet certain criteria, right? So looking at those smaller programs is often a good way to find a funding opportunity for someone who doesn't meet those mainstream criteria. All right, in terms of knowledge or just perception of scholarships, those other two issues that I mentioned earlier on. Now, as I said, there's often a lack of understanding of the criteria among scholarship applicants. And there are obviously different reasons for this. Now, one of the reasons is really that the information is often very complex, and not every foundation or program makes this information readily available. I was looking at, I think it was the Rhodes Scholarship earlier on, and you have to navigate through 3 different pages. You then have to download a PDF, and then you have to find the information in the PDF. Now, this is easy if you're sitting on your laptop, you have plenty of time. But for example, if you're accessing the page from your phone, which a lot of applicants in African countries do, it's very difficult to find this PDF and to read it on your phone. So as I said, this is something that scholarship founders or scholarship givers will hopefully consider at some point, because the reality is that many of us use our phones to browse the internet. But as it stands, unfortunately, eligibility criteria are still often quite hidden, and you have to dig through a bunch of documents to really find them. But then, as I said, another issue that is that applicants often don't do their research. So yes, it takes time to find information, and yes, you have to dig and you have to be really diligent about it. But if you're just assuming that, oh, okay, I see this very broad statement about the criteria and let me just go and apply, then as an applicant, you have also failed to do your research and to do your prep work. So my recommendation is always that if you're an applicant or if you're advising someone and there are any doubts regarding the clarity of the criteria, then don't assume, just ask. We will come back to that later, but every scholarship program has a contact person, and their job is to answer exactly those questions. So there's nothing wrong with asking. Any question you ask is better than you assuming something and then wasting your time on an unsuccessful application. Then, as I mentioned earlier, there's often this perception that strict criteria are quite unfair, which is completely understandable because we all want access to those opportunities, and sometimes it's not obvious why certain criteria exist. But what I think is important is to just understand where those are coming from, because quite often, especially with foundations, those criteria are based on the wishes of the founder, and he may have set those criteria 100 years ago. And unfortunately, with foundations, you usually cannot change the statutes or the laws of that foundation. Sometimes you can, but it's a very complicated process. So it's not the fault of the person administering the scholarship. It's not the fault of the selection committee that they set those criteria, but it's simply because many years ago, certain criteria were set, and it is impossible or very difficult to change them. And the same goes for government funding. So for example, quite often governments allocate funding for specific purposes, for example, to support certain minorities or marginalized groups. And as we know, government decisions are very complex and they're not very easy to change. So once a budget for a certain program has been approved, it's usually set. So once again, it's not the fault of the person administering the program or the people doing your interview. But this is just something that we as applicants have to take as a given, and there's no point in even getting upset about it. It's just the way it is. So once again, just don't waste your energy on those programs. There's no point in negotiating. But just because you haven't found your scholarship yet, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, right? I always say that, yes, it's tricky to find the one that works for you, but it's out there. You probably just haven't found it yet. So don't give up. Don't be upset about things you can't change. Rather, use your time and energy to continue searching, and you will find the scholarship that works for you. Okay, Now, I think this is the main issue that many of us are grappling with when it comes to eligibility criteria. So, as I always say, when you apply for a scholarship or generally with anything in life, it's good to be ambitious, but it's also important to be realistic. Now, what that means in terms of scholarships is that, yes, reach for the stars, apply for that prestigious program, but also be realistic about your chances of success, right? If you know that there will be 200,000 people applying for it and there's only 5 spots, your chances are probably not really up there, even if you are an excellent student who meets all the criteria. But what's the important part is when we're looking at those criteria, some of them really are non-negotiable. So if you don't meet them, don't bother applying. However, others, as I said, are soft or more flexible. So there is a little bit of wiggle room. Even if you don't meet them 100%, you might still be eligible for the scholarship. So the question is really, how do we distinguish between those hard and soft criteria? How do we know which ones we have to meet and which ones we can maybe work around a little bit? So this is just a little overview in very general terms. But I hope that it can serve as a guideline for you, both for your own applications and when you're advising someone. Now, those hard, non-negotiable criteria, the first indicator is usually in the language. I mean, it's a very obvious thing, but often people don't realize this. So things like the applicant must have, or he must be, or the program is only open to those kinds of applicants, or candidates without what will not be considered for the program. Those are very clear. Just the language itself tells you that if you don't meet these criteria, don't even bother applying. And typical examples of these are, for example, age, nationality, gender, and in some kind having completed a certain degree. So all of these are actually fixed attributes of yourself as a person or of your career that can't easily be changed, right? There's nothing you can do about your age or about your nationality or your gender or the fact that you have or haven't yet obtained a certain degree. And as I said earlier, this is often due to specific funding guidelines, so there really isn't much that you can do about these. Now, the interesting ones are those soft criteria, the ones that are a little bit more flexible. And once again, your first indicator is in the language used. So what we often see is that, applicants should be, or they should have, or having a certain skill is desirable, or candidates who have or who have done XYZ will be given preference. So you can already see that this is a lot more open. And typical examples of this, of these criteria are, for example, your financial situation, your academic performance, the field of study that you're in, leadership qualities, proficiency in certain skills, software, language, etc. Obviously, those are not always completely open. Sometimes there are limits to this. For example, you're required to have achieved a certain level of proficiency in something. But as we will see later, quite often there are ways to work around it or to compensate. And just as an example of those hard criteria, now this is from the MasterCard Foundation Scholarship. So for an undergraduate degree, candidates must be 29 years old or under at the time they apply, right? Same for masters, you must be 35 or under. So if you're even 3 days past your 35th birthday, don't even bother applying, because the system will automatically kick you out. Or similarly, for the Rhodes Scholarship for Kenyan applicants, you must be a citizen of Kenya, so you must have citizenship, and you must have been resident in Kenya for at least 5 of the last 10 years. So if you're Kenyan, but you've grown up in the UK, and you've actually only been to Kenya on holidays, don't bother applying. Then looking at those soft criteria, again, an example from the MasterCard Foundation Scholarship. To be considered for the program, students must be academically strong and have demonstrated a commitment to making a difference in the lives of others. Now, as you can see, this is very open, right? It doesn't say how you must demonstrate this commitment. There can be a million ways of doing so. You can, for example, have been involved in a volunteer project or in an NGO, or you might have started your own project at university, or you might just be helping out at church or in your community. Many different ways of doing that. Or another one, that's the German Academic Exchange Service. Academic achievements and potential will be assessed. And in addition, language skills, intercultural qualifications, and motivation will be taken into consideration. Now, already looking at something like intercultural qualifications, this can be anything. It can be you participating in a study tour abroad, or it can be you volunteering at a place that helps refugees, right? Anything that puts you in an intercultural context can be construed or can be argued that it supports or boosts your intercultural qualifications. So, a bit more specifically, those soft eligibility criteria. What's important to know is that their weight or the importance partly depends on the other applicants, right? So those are not fixed every year. If you have a program that's running over 5 years, then it might be that this year you're the one with the highest score in that particular field. Whereas next year, it might be completely different. So what this means is that if you apply for a certain program this year, there might be 20 people out there that score better than you in terms of, for example, their leadership quality or their community engagement, right? However, if you apply again next year, you might be applying with a completely different cohort, and you might be the only one who actually scores points in that category. So the one lesson coming out of that is that it's always worth reapplying for programs, especially if it's about those soft criteria. But the other one is, don't get demoralized because you are not at 100% in a certain field that clearly is a soft criteria, right? You might be the only one who has qualities in that field, or other candidates might score just as badly as you do. And the other important thing is that it's actually also possible to compensate for lacking in a certain field, or to explain or motivate why you don't meet a certain requirement if it's a soft requirement. So, for example, something like having to take maternity leave for a year will explain why it took you longer than the prescribed minimum duration to complete your degree. And that's a perfectly acceptable reason, right? Or, for example, if there's a requirement that you have work experience in a certain field, but you actually have only done a 6-month internship and they require 2 years, but you've been volunteering for an organization for 5 years that works in the exact same field, then you can say, okay, I did this internship, but I also actually have 5 years of volunteering experience and I spent 10 hours a week doing that. So over the course of 5 years, that should be worth just as much as 2 years of full-time work experience. So there are ways to move around or to work around them. And that is actually, and we will discuss that in another session, where your letter of motivation comes in, or additional documentation, or even your letter to the selection committee as you submit your application. But yeah, the tricky part is that doing this really requires a lot of judgment and creativity from your side. And if you're advising someone who's applying for a scholarship, so if it's not for yourself, then obviously you also need to obtain a very detailed knowledge of that person's skills, of their qualifications, and of their biography to advise them how to compensate for lacking in a certain field, or for how to explain it. So that's obviously something that you will individually work on with the person that you're advising. But what we will do from Africademics is to actually create an online form that all scholarship applicants that want to be advised by Africademics or by you fill in, so that when we refer you someone who wants to apply, then we already have the basic information about them. And obviously, if you're applying for yourself, it's a lot easier because you know yourself, you know what qualifications you have, you know what you've done, you know where you've worked. Sometimes you just need to think a little bit outside the box and look at things like volunteer engagement or projects that you've done at school or at university as a way to compensate for those more formal qualifications where maybe you don't meet the target 100%. Okay, so as I said earlier, those hard criteria, they're usually fixed attributes, right? Your age, your gender, your nationality, there's nothing you can do to change that. But for the soft criteria, that's actually quite different. So another way of working around them is that rather than explaining why you don't meet them or trying to compensate, you can actually actively improve yourselves in certain fields before or while you submit the application. And that's also why it's so important to not only look for scholarships once you need them urgently, but to be constantly on the lookout for opportunities, to know what's out there, to know what programs you might qualify for. So if you come across something that actually sounds like a great fit for you, but you see there are certain areas where you don't really think that your current CV or your current skill set is really good enough to qualify, what you can do is you apply the following year and you use the time from now to the application deadline to work specifically on those fields or on those issues. So for example, if a program is very technical and it requires you to have knowledge or skills or experience in using a certain technical software, take a free online course. We are in the age of online courses. There are pages like Coursera or edX where we can literally find courses on anything. They're free, sometimes they're time intensive, but there are so many resources out there that help us acquire certain skills without having to pay for it or without having to go through a 10-month in-person course, that we can really use those to our advantage. Or for example, if a scholarship is for a certain field of study, say it's for marketing only, right? So now you haven't studied marketing, but you did a general business degree and you actually took 3 classes in marketing and you did a marketing project and you also decided to take one of your electives in marketing, then mention that, because sure, you don't have the full degree, but just having taken those classes and having done extra projects will demonstrate that you actually have knowledge in that field. Same goes for work experience, for example. Sometimes a program requires you to, say, have 2 years of work experience. If you don't have that yet, and if, for example, you've done a 1-year internship and you've done a little bit of work on the side, and you still have 6 months until the application deadline, use it. Try and do an internship or go and volunteer with a local NGO. Yes, it's not paid work, but it is something that you can put on your CV. And if you get a proper certificate for it that states what you've done, how much you've worked, and so on and so forth, it's worth almost as much as a formal job. So there are ways of working around these things. And the same one goes for leadership skills. I mean, that's something that very often comes up, and it's not a very clear term. I mean, leadership skills can be anything, right? But if you're not really quite sure what physical, tangible evidence you have of your leadership skills, launch a project at your university. You can start a group that supports marginalized students, or you can start a tutoring team for students struggling with online learning. Or you can look at, okay, what's actually needed in my community? Maybe you want to start a food drive or a clothes drive and collect items for the needy. Or maybe there's a project in your church where you can take on a leadership role and say, okay, there's an event coming up. I will be leading this part of the event. And then you ask the person leading it to give you a letter of recommendation for it. So it's often just about framing what you've already done in the correct way, or looking at alternative opportunities to gain that experience. And luckily, with those soft criteria, those are things that you can change, that you can constantly work on and improve. So even if right now you feel that you're not really up there, use the time until the application deadline, or even after the application deadline and before you start the program that you want to start, to improve your own CV. Okay, and then last but not least, I've touched on this earlier, but what I often see is that applicants are quite hesitant to reach out to foundations to ask for clarification. So what they do instead is that they see certain criteria and they assume this is how it is. And then, I've said this before, you come to a point where you make wrong assumptions and you put a lot of work and effort into an application and then you get rejected. So rather than assuming something, always ask. There are, as I said, people in each scholarship program or foundation whose job it is to deal with applicants' questions. And it's always better to ask than to waste your time. However, and this is very, very important, do your research before reaching out. There is nothing more annoying to a scholarship administrator then having people ask questions about things that are already on the website or in the program description, because it means that you haven't done your work. And if you haven't done your work, then you're probably not a good scholarship applicant, right? So you don't want to put yourself into that position where you're the person asking stupid questions or obvious questions just because you haven't bothered to actually do the work. So before you write that email to the program administrator, dig through the website, look at those hidden PDFs, look at the frequently asked questions, and look at the application guidelines. And make sure that you read them thoroughly. Don't just skim through them. And if your question isn't answered, then go and ask. There's nothing wrong with it. Absolutely not. And also when you're advising other applicants, don't do the work for them. Yes, it's sometimes very tedious to find that information, but it's also part of the process, right? And if you as an applicant are not willing or able to put in the work to clarify eligibility criteria, how are you going to cope with the workload of a study program? So this is actually an important step in preparing you as an applicant for what's to come. And it's also a way to prove yourself worthy, for lack of a better word, for that scholarship. All right, and that's it for today. I've put together a little summary just to recap what we've discussed. So first and foremost, eligibility criteria basically provide a framework both for applicants and the selection committee, and they provide a guideline to help you decide whether or not it's worth applying for a certain program. Sometimes criteria can be very broad, sometimes they're very narrow, and there's always this trade-off between access to a scholarship and competition, right? Very broad criteria, easy access in terms of applying, but there's usually a lot of competition, so it makes it less likely for you to get it. Whereas narrowly targeted programs, not as easily accessible, but much less competition, so much higher chances of you getting it. And both for your own applications and when you're advising someone, the first step, and I mean, that's a very obvious thing, but do your research. Ensure you 100% understand the criteria. Try already to distinguish between the hard and soft ones. Make sure you meet the hard ones. Think about ways of meeting the soft ones. If you don't meet the hard ones, don't even bother applying, but start thinking about how you meet those soft eligibility criteria. Think about ways to use other skill sets that you have to compensate, substitute, or use your letter of motivation to motivate certain things, right? And then if in doubt, as I said, ask, reach out to the scholarship program or reach out to an alumnus, someone possibly even within the Africademics community who has applied for that particular program and who's familiar with it. Don't waste your time, don't waste other people's time. And last but not least, as I said earlier, when you're advising scholarship applicants, the first step is really to gain as much information about the education, their biography, their skills, and their qualifications, because that will help you help them to navigate this jungle of eligibility criteria and to use the less obvious skills or the less obvious experiences they have to possibly compensate for lack of experience in other areas when it comes to those soft criteria. All right, so in terms of the next steps for this week, as always, please complete the quiz. The link will be shared together with the recording. And also, as every month, go through the latest opportunities that we've posted on the Facebook group and the WhatsApp channel. And this week, just have a look at the different eligibility criteria, just to give you an idea of what those programs typically look for. I know many of you have already done this extensively for your own scholarship research, but as I said, every program is different, and for me, it's always really helpful to just keep in mind what are those typical criteria. Sometimes they change over the years, sometimes there's new focus areas, so it's always good to be up to date with what foundations and universities actually look for. What I would also encourage you to do is to use the WhatsApp group actively to post at least one question, a comment, or a personal experience with eligibility criteria in the group. We had a really, really nice discussion last week when people started asking questions, others started sharing their own experiences. And I really think we have such a wealth of experience and knowledge in our ambassador group that I really, really encourage you to make use of it and to kickstart that conversation with your fellow ambassadors. And then last but not least, the voluntary case study will be shared on Tuesday, and this is the Tuesday after the deadline for submission of the quiz, which is the 9th of April. All right. That's it for this week. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope this was helpful for you and looking forward to the next lecture. Bye, everyone.